So here we go again, Atlantis, the story that never seems to really go away, or maybe a more accurate description would be the idea of a story that never goes away, because that is, as we will learn, maybe one of the main issues with the story is that people are talking about their belief about what Plato wrote rather than what Plato actually did write in his book. Because this is what Jimmy Corsetti and so many others before him have done. And if you're unfamiliar with Jimmy, he hosts a YouTube channel called Bright Insight 6. Note that the name will be a bit of a bait and switch further on. Now, Jimmy has a degree in communication and has been working as a theft and fraud investigation. This work background might be a bit ironic since he has fallen for Hancock's and Randall Carson's less than credible ideas. I'm a bit unsure how Jimmy got into all of this, but let's review his videos and see if we can maybe get through to someone and maybe change some mind on the subjects. Now, Jimmy seems to be an intelligent person who has fallen for a bit of false ideas, but enough about Corsetti for now. Let's instead see if there's any truth to Jimmy Corsetti's claims about the Raichette structure being the location of Atlantis. But where do we begin an investigation of a claim like this? The most obvious place would be to see if the account is credible to start with. How would a historian or archaeologist approach this theory? First, we would see if there's any primary sources for the claim. And what do we mean when we say primary source then? Shortly summarized, it could be described that this is an original account created during or immediately after the event took place. It can come in several different forms, shapes, and even content for that matter. But it often splits up in two categories. The first one is manuscript. These are writing that were not intended for public print and are often handwritten in many cases. And if they are circulated, it will be in a very tiny scale, a small scale. It's often things like letters, journals, but even a laundry list would end up in these sections. Secondly, we have published sources. These are intended for the public consummation and have been circulated for people with the intention that they are supposed to read it. Here we put news articles, debates, memoirs, and public addresses from, the heads of states. Something worth considering with these sources are that they are often edited and often have an agenda that we must consider when we are reviewing them. That does not mean that a manuscript would be totally free from an agenda, but they can be more raw since the author often did not intended for them to be read by a different person. Therefore, he has a sense of privacy, or she, when they wrote the account. And as an archaeologist, I would be a poor such if I forgot to mention that we also have artifacts and excavation that would serve as a primary source. Now, excavation can be noteworthy since it can corroborate what both primary and secondary sources are telling us. We always want to use a primary source in research and when we want to learn how and why an event took place. Now, this might not be possible for several different reasons, but we can use secondary sources. These often include books, articles, or other mediums. The difference is that they are not original accounts and usually have been selected from a different source to kind of interrogate the past. Here, with the secondary sources, it's even more important that we make sure that the author is actually relying on the primary sources and are themselves not relying on additional secondary sources. So, for example, for a book, if we read it, a good rule of thumb is that the broader the bookscape are, the more secondary sources the author use. So if it covers a lot of different things, well, then we need to kind of be careful with this source. but if it's a very narrow scope the book has, then it's usually using more primary sources in its research and therefore a bit more reliable when we want to use it in our research. Robert Williams has a great example in his book The Historian's Toolbox, where he brought up the 1C protocol, for example. This account was documented by Adolf Eichmann during the 1E's conference in 1942 and discussed the final solution. But this is an obvious example of a primary source. It was written by someone who was an attendee at the conference while it took place. A secondary source would be any book that used this document to tell the history of the Holocaust. The secondary source using the original to interpret an event and tell us about it within a context. But even if we have the source material right in front of us, there is a critical question we must ask ourselves, something that will become very clear as we go forward. Any historian worth their salt must ask himself what the document's purpose was. Why was it written? Why was it published? We need to have these questions in mind and then proceed with a good amount of skepticism towards the material. So, how many primary sources do we have on Atlantis? Now, the answer might shock you, but we have 0 primary sources to the above-mentioned specification. And you might rightly be a bit surprised about this. But even Plato stated that Critias the Older got the information from Dropides during a story competition, basically. Dropides got it himself from Solon, who heard the story from an Egyptian priest. And if we assume that the event in Timaeus and Critias to be factual, there is no primary source of the story. Some of you might object here, claiming that there are other sources for Atlantis. And I can hear you loudly typing your comment as I'm saying this. Well, I believe you might gabbing about Hellenesius of Lesbos poem he wrote titled Atlantis. While Hellenicus predates Plato by almost 100 years, the poem is not about the fantastic city of Atlantis. The poem was found among the Oxyrhynchus papyri within volume 11 and was designated with number 1359. These are a collection of papyri found around the turn of the previous century at what's known today as Al-Bahanassa. The poem is a literary work about the Titan Atlas' daughters. You can read the translation and the original, widely available online, and you don't have to take my word for it. So this poem is not to any help if you want to prove that there was a city of Atlantis. Some might now yell into the void that the authors after Plato talk about Atlantis. That's of course true, but the thing is that they have in common that they all refer to a single same source and work written by Plato. They don't add anything to the account, no secondary sources, no primary sources. They essentially just repeat what Plato wrote in Timaeus and Critias. So our only source is Plato, which is not a primary source. And when it comes to the historical method, we want to use as many different accounts as possible when we want to look at an event. The more we have, the more likely it is that it actually occurred. We would also want to see that the report is quite close in time to when the event took place. But according to Plato himself, it's almost 9,000 years between him and that event, more or less. And as we see as we go forward, there's no archaeological evidence for that part. So with the historical method in mind, the case for Atlantis looks rather bleak from the start. Here we are with a single source or two, depending on how you want to define Timaeus and Critias, if it's one account or two accounts. I would not, since it's the same author for both of these texts. We should now ask ourselves if Plato intended this to be a historical account of an actual event. And here I'd say that as things are looking, that's not really the case. Plato was never much of a historian in his writing. While he used several different historical figures and events that were often adapted to prove a point that Plato was trying to make. Something we saw, for example, in the case of Gyga's ring back in episode 39. Should go and check that up if you haven't already. It is not only history Plato used in his writing to prove a point, but also disciplines such as cosmology and the creation of man. And we don't see Jimmy Corsetti or Hancock argue that the creation story that we see in Timaeus is an accurate description on how things was created. I don't really believe that Plato intended that to be a literal description either. He's using it to explain thoughts he brought up in his book The Republic. As I mentioned in episode 40, where we read the book after Timaeus in what was supposed to be a trilogy, this took place the evening after the event that occurred in the Republic. And if you read them carefully, Timaeus and Critias are filled with throwbacks to the Republic. For example, in the Republic, Socrates talks about the different scientists and how they are, different from each other. Socrates suggests, however, a new way for mathematicians and astronomers to approach science to correctly grasp what he referred to as the principle and ultimately the greater good. By correcting the mistake of not forming a hypothesis and moving toward a more dialectic approach, this science can evolve into being a study of, being in itself. The whole idea of cosmology in Timaeus is to demonstrate that the highest form of principle is not only a principle of mere being, but also a principle of coming into being. We learn that cosmology principles are fundamental in learning about the world we can see around us. Now, this is mere SparkNote versions of Plato's approach in Timaeus. And if you are interested in this, I highly recommend reading Thomas Johnson's essay, The Timaeus on the Principles of Cosmology, and also the book Cosmos and Perception in Plato's Timaeus by Mark Calderon. As you might note, there's a lot more to the topic than I have covered here, but I argue that this is sufficient to demonstrate that it's not meant to be a literal account in either Timaeus or Critias. At the beginning of Critias, as we heard last time, Timaeus even say, I offer my prayer to the God who was just created in my speech, though of course he in fact was created long, long ago. Hinting at a Greek story tradition where multiple accounts of the god can exist simultaneously and be true for the sake of the story that's going to be told to the audience. So, is the narrative in Critias to be taken as a literal account? Again, we can find the answer by looking closely at the text. If we read the beginning of Timaeus carefully, we will see that Socrates are asking the attendees to place the perfect state that he told about in the Republic in a war against an equal foe. Socrates states, that's why, once I delivered the account I'd been instructed to give, I gave you in turn the assignment I'm now asking you to carry out. It is here Hermocrates claims that Critias just so happened to know a story that would fit the assignment at hand. So Critias tells the story about Atlantis as he heard it as a mere 10-year-old boy during a storytelling festival by his then 90-year-old grandfather, Critias the Elder. Now, Critias the Elder heard it from his father, Dropides II, who in turn heard it from Solon, which Plato described as a friend and a relative to the family. even if this connection might be a bit dubious when people has looked a bit closer at this. Solon in turn heard it while in Egypt by a priest, and we will return to Solon in a short bit here. But with all of this in mind, it's hard to argue that Plato was serious about this being a literal account. Atlantis seems to be mere of a plot device, the evil empire to be bested by Socrates' perfect society. Plato lived in a society of stories, theater, and poetry. Would it strange to borrow from these art forms in his storytelling? He was someone who was quite masterful at the art of rhetoric. Why Plato is adding all these details into the story is to make different points in his storytelling and to give the bad guys a reason for their wickedness. Take, for example, the difference between Athens and Atlantis from a geological perspective. Athens is just made out of earth, a stable element that helps the city to stay on course and endure. Compare this to Atlantis, where Poseidon is mixing both earth and water, creating an unstable mixture. Do you remember that Atlantis had two springs, one hot and one cold? Another hint that Poseidon can't really create the stability and balance that the far wiser Athena and Hephaestus can with their creation in Athens. Athens has, for example, only one spring, but it has the same nice temperature all year round, and this helps keep balance and order within the city. We also learn about the origin of Atlantis' depravity. If you recall, in the previous episode, we learned that the downfall of Atlantis was the diluted blood in their veins. Note that the dilution can't happen if there's nothing to dilute with. And of course, it's how Atlantis opened up to trade and starting to let foreigners into the city and living there. And as time went by, the spirit and blood of Poseidon that coursed through the vein of this Atlanteus grew weaker, leaving room for imperialism and greed to grow within the population. This is not a story about a civilization, but a warning of the issues Plato and probably other Athenians saw in their own society at this point in history. And also, why spend the entirety of the Republic building a perfect society in fantasy on paper when he had all this time an example of this perfect historical society all along? He could just have started telling about Atlantis and Athens instead of doing it after the fact. It doesn't really make sense in that way. So in a sense, there's no real need to search for Atlantis, since it was never a real place or a location that Plato intended to be a real place. It was a thought experiment and mere fiction, not intended to be taken seriously. But you might ask, what about Solon? Yeah, what about him? Stay tuned and we will be right back.
Det är en galen fantasi att aliens manipulerar oss med telepati. Ni tycker att jag redan är besatt, men jag skyddar mig för jag har foliehatt.